everyone. This is Matt Williams from Jesus College at the University of Oxford, speaking to you from lockdown in Oxfordshire. Really hope that you and your families are keeping safe and well at this difficult time. The aim of this video today is to give you some advice as to what we look for in prospective Oxford students based on my experience of working in Oxford admissions for about a decade for politics-related degrees. I'm also what's known as the Access Fellow at Jesus College in Oxford. Jesus College is one of the 39 constituent colleges of the University of Oxford. You can see a photo of it on my desktop. And what we do as the Access Fellows is that we are responsible at the various colleges and departments at Oxford University for widening opportunities to admissions. In other words, to take people who, for various reasons, may have struggled to make a competitive application to Oxford, often because of relative disadvantages in their lives, be it economic or educational, and we try and level the playing field in admissions. And we do that for two simple reasons. Firstly, because it's quite wrong that Oxford doesn't very well represent the whole of British society and the diversity of the global community. It's not as bad as many people think, but it needs to be much better. And the second reason is because it's self-harm. If we want to maintain a position as one of the world's best universities and endure for another 900 years, as we have at the top of the tree, then we need to be taking the talents of everyone into consideration, not just the privileged few. And so that's why we do access work to make the university more accessible. And so I thought at this time of lockdown, it might be quite helpful for me to share some thinking skills advice to some sort of exercises you can do, a little bit like a mental workout, a brain workout, if you like, for you to have some thoughts and to maybe develop your skills so that you could make a competitive application to a university like Oxford should you wish to in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up a presentation for this. And so what we need to do first of all is to think about how you think. So do a little bit of an audit. Try and work out how your mind works and see how you can potentially enhance that. Now, one important thing to bear in mind is that when people ask me what is Oxford looking for in its prospective students, we are looking for people that are smart, but we're very clear that actually you can enhance your cognition, you can make yourself smarter. I think a lot of people assume that Oxford students are somehow born geniuses, that they have IQs of, say, 140 and above, and they just find problem solving inherently easy. Now, for a start, there are severe problems with the very concept of IQ and whether or not intelligence can be measured. And I have deep misgivings about that. So you don't have some sort of fixed, immutable intelligence quotient, as far as I'm concerned, that is completely unchangeable. I mean, why would there even be schools and universities if we assumed that your intellectual skills couldn't be enhanced? It would just be pointless. So you can definitely enhance those skills, just as you can enhance practically any skill you care to think of. You might have a natural disposition to being good at, say, sports or dancing or cookery, but practice and perseverance will make you better at those things, just as it will with thinking skills. So these thinking skills are absolutely accessible. I think a lot of people wrongly assume that if you're not somehow a winner in the lottery of genetics and you have this sort of amazing brain, that you might as well not bother. And I find that mindset really depressing, because of course you can enhance your thinking skills, and we'd love to help you. So do just practice and you'll get better. So first of all, what do you think? Well, let's have a look. Let's just start with a bit of an audit. Think about how you think through problems. What's your approach to processing data and trying to come up with solutions to questions? Just try and be a bit self-reflective, because it can actually be tremendously useful to just diagnose your thought processes. Don't pathologize anything. In other words, don't sort of think, oh, I must do this badly, I must do this wrong. This is not an opportunity to criticize yourself, just to be honest and think about, well, if I'm confronted with a problem, how does my mind tend to work? And let's start with an exercise. Let's take a look at this. Now, this is a datum. This is a piece of information. Now, it's obviously quite a familiar piece of information. It's the US flag. What I'd like you to do is perhaps pause the video, take a second or two to consider this datum, and just to try and work out some things that you think are interesting about it. So very open-ended exercise, just look at it, just absorb it, just think about it. And as I say, feel free to pause the video and give yourself a couple of minutes to just think through it. Okay? So, how do you analyze data and think about a problem? How did you look at that flag and interpret its contents and work out what you think is interesting about it? Well, the way I would suggest you trying to develop your thinking skills and the archetype of the way Oxford students and academics tend to think, I would argue, is something of a hybrid between a toddler and Sherlock Holmes. Now, what I mean by that is just an extremely perceptive attention to detail. Toddlers, so those, children of about the ages between 2 and say 8 or 9, I mean, a 9-year-old's not really a toddler, but anyway, are extremely curious, perceptive, interested in the world around them. They ask all sorts of fantastic questions, and they're not worried about what people think of them for asking those questions. So I've got a 3-year-old myself, and he asks me all of the sort of classic questions, why is the sky blue? Why can't I eat chocolate for breakfast? Why can't I spit in the supermarket? I mean, when you sort of stop to think about this as an adult, it's tempting to sort of just brush those sorts of questions aside as just the impetuousness of youth. But actually, they are fantastically perceptive questions. Why can't we do these things? Unless you think about them carefully, it's tempting to just sort of swat them away. But we shouldn't swat those sorts of questions away because they are, in fact, really good questions and well worth our time in considering. And for example, my son, Teddy, asked me when we were watching Tom and Jerry the other day, why is Tom a cat? And this probably says a lot about something that's wrong with me, but I stayed up for a good portion of that night working out, well, why is Tom a cat? What is this sort of cultural obsession with cats chasing mice? And why did they decide in the 1940s, 50s to come up with this cartoon in that time and that era? Anyway, I obviously have a bit of a problem. I overanalyze things. But I was just so struck by the perceptiveness of that question. I'd never stopped to ask, why are Tom and Jerry a cat and a mouse? What is the point? Why aren't they, a bird and a lizard? Why is all of this stuff around us? Why do I take it for granted so much? And that's the basic point. A toddler and Sherlock Holmes would never take any detail for granted. They would always question, why? That's your most powerful perceptive tool, is the question why. And it's the sort of thing that will really help you develop your thinking skills. And Sherlock Holmes, similarly, if he was surveying a crime scene, every detail comes under his consideration. So if we come back to the if we go back to the US flag, the reason I chose this as a point for you to assess your thinking skills is because it's such a familiar image that we quite quickly take its contents for granted. An issue when analysing a datum like the American flag is to draw on facts that other people have told us. Now, there's nothing wrong with that as an initial introduction to a datum. So you might, for example, know that the flag has 50 white stars to represent each of the 50 states of the United States of America. You may also know that it has 13 stripes interchanging red and white to represent the original 13 colonies of America. Those are important and interesting facts about the flag. The issue with repeating those facts is that it suggests you're not thinking about the data, or the datum in this case, for yourself. You're allowing other people's priorities to speak on your behalf. Someone has told you it's got 50 stars and 13 stripes, and that's why you prioritize that information. You assume that is what's most interesting about the flag. Now, I'm not saying that's not interesting about the flag, but it suggests that you're not really thinking about it on your own terms. You're thinking about it through someone else's priorities. Now, if a toddler was to be handed the American flag, he or she would, or might likely have never seen it before, and would ask far more, often, not always, but far more perceptive questions that they are interested in. They might, for example, ask, why are there stars on this flag? Not why are there 50 stars, but why are there stars at all? What is the significance of the star? And a Sherlock Holmes sort of character with an eye for detail would say, well, why do these stars have 5 points to them? Why do stars, when they're represented symbolically, have points at all? Because stars in reality don't have points. Stars are not pointy things. They are sort of swirling balls of gas. So why do we represent them with points? Now, of course, the straightforward answer to why they're pointed is because when you look at a star with the naked eye in particular, it twinkles. And so those twinkles look like points, and so we tend to represent them as points. Why do they have 5 points is an interesting cultural and anthropological question. Now, there's no way that a toddler would necessarily know or be able to guess the answer to that, but at least they are thinking about the curious fact that the stars have 5 points. It's not an irrelevant datum, it is a crucial detail. And they, someone who's a bit older and might know a few flags would also recognize that not only the American flag has 5 pointed stars, but also the Chinese flag, also many flags in the Islamic world. So it's a really curious pattern that countries around the world, including countries that are at odds with each other in geopolitical sense, adopt 5 pointed stars. So that must mean that there's a common ancestry, a common cultural ancestor to the symbol of a star. And in fact, the answer is the Egyptians, as in the case of many cultural artifacts. It was the Egyptian hieroglyph for a star that's 5 pointed, and that symbol of stars was gifted to the rest of the world. Of course, you come across other stars, such as the Star of David with 6 points, and you sometimes get 4 pointed stars, or the Australian flag has, and the New Zealand flag has 7 pointed stars. But nonetheless, the 5 pointed star is perhaps the most iconic, the most typical way of representing stars. Now, we've already gone into a lot more depth just by asking ourselves some questions that a toddler might ask. And, just starting off with that curiosity and then going to explore perhaps online to find some plausible answers would be a good start. To many of the questions you might pose, there won't actually be any answers, and that is particularly liberating and particularly important for developing your thinking skills. You have to be comfortable with doubt at university. When we get to university level, we are starting to sort of push at the boundaries of what is known about the universe. And that's true of all of the disciplines that we teach at Oxford and all the disciplines you would be taught at any good university in the world. We are trying to develop new knowledge, new understanding, new theories. So by definition, we're dealing with phenomena that we just don't have absolute handle on. Whereas at schools, it's perhaps more likely that you'll be taught something that we have a bit more of a steer on, and there's a bit less room for debate. But with some phenomena, that's just not the case. And some people freak out a little bit by that. They just don't like the lack of certainty. They get unnerved by the notion that some things are not black and white and there may not be a correct answer that you can reach. But I would encourage you, if you want to think more like an Oxford student, to revel in that doubt, because it's liberating. It means that you have the opportunity to have a conversation with an expert, because that expert, when it comes to something such as what's the nature of gravitational waves or which is the best Shakespeare play, doesn't have the correct answer because the correct answer doesn't exist. So you have the opportunity to have a really lively conversation with those people. Indeed, we encourage it. That's the whole point of an Oxford interview, is to encourage people to express themselves, to think for themselves. So starting with curious toddler-esque questions such as why do the stars have 5 points, and then delving into some of the questions that may not have any answers is a really good way to develop your thinking skills. And crucially, just taking nothing for granted, even things you're very, very familiar with, should be analysed in depth and detail. So a few more toddler questions you might want to come up with. Why red, white and blue? Why those colours? Why isn't the American flag sort of brown, purple and gold? Why stripes? Why horizontal stripes? Stripes, one theory is that stripes are, that they connote imprisonment, and that's why that in the past a prisoner's uniform would be striped, and that the original 13 colonies were therefore making a protest against the British Empire in the 18th century, proclaiming that we are the prisoners of tyranny, and so hence the stripes. Now that's a detail about the American flag, or at least a theory about the American flag, that most people are not familiar with. They will be able to tell you the number of stars and stripes, but they might not know that detail. And that's what I'm talking about. By looking in greater detail and depth, you can come up with some more juicy, more insightful, more perceptive analyses of these things, just by taking off the glasses that someone else has put on your head, saying, oh, you should look for the number of stars and stripes, and saying, no, I'm going to look at this for myself. I'm going to look for the details that I would look for if I'd never seen this before, if I was a toddler, if I was Sherlock Holmes. I mean, you can go into absolute depth on this. You could ask why are flags rectangular? What's the sort of importance in terms of flagginess to having a rectangular shape? Why are the colours red, white, and blue so common? In fact, there's only one flag on Earth that's a UN member state that doesn't have one of those three colours, and that's Jamaica. So, these are quite flaggy colours as well. Why does the US flag have its sort of canton with blue, the blue canton with white stars in the top left corner? Why not in the middle? Why not in the bottom right? Why are the stars aligned geometrically? Why aren't they sort of arranged in a pattern, such as you might see with the Australian flag, which describes the Southern Cross constellation, or the Brazilian flag? So just go mad. Ask as many questions as you can. Pick some that you find particularly interesting, do a bit of research about it, but for goodness sake, never let someone just answer these questions for you conclusively. And there may be some questions for which there is a pretty sort of uncontroversial answer, but there'll be many that aren't. I mean, why is the flag red, white, and blue is actually a subject of quite interesting debate. So indulge and enjoy it. That's how to develop your thinking skills. Think a bit more like a toddler and a bit more like Sherlock Holmes. Now, to further practice these thinking skills, I'm going to sort of segment my analysis of how to think more efficiently and more effectively by going through some past Oxford interview questions. Now, these are all real interview questions that have been used at Oxford University. They won't be used again, so I'm not sort of advantaging anyone in talking through these, but if you can think through some past questions, it can help you develop your thinking skills further. So let's start with this one. Now, this is a very generic question. What is humanity's greatest achievement? Okay, so give yourself a second just to think about this. And remember some of the points I made about how it is common to think. Okay, so just have a think. What is humanity's greatest achievement? Now, as I mentioned with regard to the US flag, there's a temptation to answer almost impulsively, just sort of blurt out something that may be coming from that you may not be answering authentically. In terms of what you think is humanity's greatest achievement, you may be tempted to answer in a way that you think is socially acceptable. So something that somebody else has told you is an amazing achievement. So, for example, one of the most common answers to this question is the moon landing. That landing two men on the moon and having a third man orbit the moon to pick them up again was the greatest achievement of humanity. Okay, and that's a reasonable answer. My slight problem with it is that it doesn't seem to be an answer that reflects a person thinking about it for themselves. It seems to be a knee-jerk, impulsive response to a question. And this is one of the key thinking skills. In addition to being curious and perceptive like a toddler, you also need to just slow down your thought processes. It can be tempting to think too impulsively. And if you do that, then the chances increase that you won't be answering in your own terms, but you'll be answering for somebody else. It'll be as if someone sat on your shoulder and whispering into your ear and saying to you, oh, well, you ought to say the moon landing, because that's obviously what everyone else would say. But don't answer the way everyone else would say. Universities encourage you to be an independent thinker, and that's no more true than of Oxford University. So, for goodness sake, think about it for yourself. Now, as I say, there's nothing prima facie wrong with saying that the moon landing is humanity's greatest achievement. So my first piece of advice when you're being asked a question like this is, by all means, play to your strengths. If your mind goes to that sort of place and thinks, well, the moon landing is probably humanity's greatest achievement, that's fine, but at least be aware that you need to enhance that. It's not enough to just blurt something like that out. You need to develop it. And in an interview setting, I would ask a candidate to explain more. Why is the moon landing humanity's greatest achievement? Please justify that so that I can be on the same page with you. I'm not necessarily just going to agree with you automatically. You need to convince me. So play to your strengths. If you have certain information, if you have certain thoughts, if you've perhaps got an area of interest that you've done some research in, for goodness sake, use that. Don't be shy of that. It may be that you're interested in the moon landing itself. Fine, great, good for you. But don't just say the moon landing then. Give us something a little bit different. Be more specific, perhaps. What was it about the moon landing? What was the particular thing? Maybe it's the extraordinary agglomeration of resources and bureaucratic infrastructure that was needed to make that happen. Maybe that is what is the greatest part of the greatest achievement of humanity. You can also, be quite meta. I mean, it could be that the greatest achievement of humanity is the fact that people so commonly say the moon landing is our greatest achievement. In other words, somehow we've all been convinced, perhaps even brainwashed, into saying somewhat impulsively that it was obviously landing on the moon was our greatest achievement, and that we have become a bit less self-critical. Is an interesting thought. It's a sort of bit of PR genius. My second piece of advice is be self-aware. Be clear what you're not necessarily sure about, and also be clear as to why you might be tempted to go down certain paths in your thinking process. For example, it may be that you answer a certain way because of a deep emotional attachment to a certain answer. So you might be tempted to say that humanity's greatest achievement is landing on the moon because you're a proud American. Again, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it may mean that you struggle to convince someone else who may, for similarly emotional reasons, doesn't hold that point of view. Or you might be tempted to argue that advances in medicine, specific advances in medicine, are humanity's greatest achievement precisely because you or your family have benefited from them. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with saying that, but just be self-aware. Just realize that that could be the origin of your answer. So, for example, I'm half blind, so I might be tempted to say that advances in ophthalmology are humanity's greatest achievement because they've changed my life. But that might not be persuasive for somebody else, and I just need to be aware of that. I could maybe help them along that path. I could maybe try and persuade them that ophthalmology is humanity's greatest achievement, but they won't automatically just follow me on that journey. So I need to be aware that that could be a problem. Okay? It's also important to try and think creatively, and this links to the first 2 points, just to sort of think a bit more creatively, not automatically. By slowing down your thought processes when you're being confronted with a question like this, you can start to create an interesting and unusual response to the question. And a very important way of developing your creativity is to work in detail. Now, again, this is where the toddler and Sherlock Holmes can be useful archetypes. Toddlers and Sherlock Holmes both have in common their attention to detail, their fastidiousness. And so if I was to ask a toddler or Sherlock Holmes, what is humanity's greatest achievement? They wouldn't really be prepared to answer that until they pin down what it means for something to be great or an achievement, or indeed what constitutes humanity. So you should do the same. If you want to be more creative in your thought process, be fastidious, be pedantic to an extraordinary degree. For example, greatest is ambiguous. Now, that ambiguity is liberating. It allows us to come up with multiple plausible interpretations of the word. The greatest could mean something morally edifying, something sort of wondrous that sends chills down our spines, such as the moon landing. But greatness could also just mean scale. So we could say that the greatest achievement is simply that which is largest in scale. And therefore, a plausible answer to this question, what is humanity's greatest achievement, is rubbish, trash is humanity's greatest achievement, insofar as there are few examples of things that as a species we've created more of. There's so much trash in the oceans that in some places it forms islands that are as large as countries. We've produced so much rubbish and trash that it's floating in space. So it's not necessarily a great achievement in the sense that it's something that we would celebrate, but it is a great achievement in the sense of its enormity in scale, and that could be a way to develop your creativity. You could also think carefully about achievement. It might be tempting to say that it is an achievement that we have developed such large brains, but I suppose a critic would argue that might not have been something that was striven for. Achievement suggests some sort of agency, that people sort of set a goal and sought out to obtain that goal. And therefore, talking about the growth of your brains is not necessarily something that you would achieve in that interpretation of the word. Anyway, the point is that if you want to unlock your creativity, it's always good to start at the very foundations, the very sort of building blocks of a question. Don't let any of the question wording just float over you. Pull it apart, dump it into a proverbial acid bath, and work out how the bits could fit together to your advantage. And finally, fourthly, examine alternatives to your thinking and practice advocacy. Let's say you're tempted to argue that the moon landing is humanity's greatest achievement. That's fine. But what might your critics say? What might other people say? Be empathetic with other thinkers. Why would someone who's perhaps inured in a different discipline argue something totally different? And how could I convince them that actually my argument is better than theirs? That degree of empathy is essential to persuasive thinkers. I mean, think about politicians. Politicians are exceptionally good at this for the most part, that they think very carefully, how would someone who's not wearing my shoes, how can I convince them that I've got the answers for them? Now, one particularly interesting trick you can try with questions like this is to just be arbitrary, to practice advocacy in the sense that if you're a lawyer who has been given a brief, you might be told you have to defend this client and you're given, a day or two to prepare your defense. You don't necessarily believe in their guilt or innocence or otherwise, but you just have to go and put together a defense as best you can. Now, sometimes that can be quite an effective way to answer these questions. In other words, to just pick something, anything, fairly arbitrarily, and then work backwards to a defense. The reason that can work quite well is because people get hung up a lot of the time on, what do I think? What do I believe? What's my emotional connection to this question? When actually that's not necessarily that important. If ultimately your goal is to try and come up with a persuasive and interesting answer to these questions, it doesn't really matter whether or not you believe your answer. What matters is in how you show off your skills. For example, if someone is aspiring to be a top chef, they don't necessarily have to like the food that they're making, but it needs to demonstrate that they have extraordinary capacity to make such food. And a similar thing works with thinking skills. So you don't need to believe the answers that you're providing, but you want to show off to the greatest capacity your ability to think independently and creatively. That's the sort of thing that admissions tutors like myself are looking for. So what you could do, for example, is to just have a quick scan around the room around you, pick something, and just work backwards and say, that over there, that is humanity's greatest achievement. I'll come up with some defense of it. So take bottled water, for example. Why don't you have a couple of minutes to think how you could defend, if you had to, in court, that bottled water is in fact humanity's greatest ever achievement. Have a little think about that. I mean, some possible answers could be, of course, that it's improved the transportation of a vital life resource. Maybe a more cynical response would be that the economics of bottled water is an astonishing achievement. The fact that in a country like the UK, people are encouraged to buy bottled water and do so to the tune of billions of pounds every year is quite amazing, given that the tap water is drinkable in the UK. So it's an act of absolute marketing genius. It's often said that a good salesperson could sell sand to the Arabs and ice to the Inuit in Canada. Well, some genius has worked out how to sell water to the British, right, in bottles, and the markup, the profit markup is extraordinary. It's in the thousands of percent, and it's for a commodity. Bottled water is more expensive per volume than oil and gasoline and petrol. It's just beggars belief. So it's an absolute genius bit of economics and marketing. So from that perspective, you could say this is an insane achievement. So, that's another sort of trick you could try, is just not get too sort of emotionally hung up. Oh, I'm not sure. Is it landing on the moon? Is it, the Mona Lisa? What is humanity's greatest achievement? Just pick something and work backwards. That can be actually quite a lot of fun, and it can lead to more creative responses. So we've now got sort of 4 broad principles of how to enhance your thinking skills, and they produce a relatively memorable acronym, which is PACE, because that's one of the key themes of this session. If you want to enhance your thinking skills, just slow it down. Avoid impulsive thinking. Those sorts of thoughts that pop up into your mind are perhaps going to be the product of someone else's thought processes. You've been sort of drilled and conditioned when you've been given a datum or a problem to come up with this response almost sort of automatically. And that could mean that you are avoiding thinking about the problem in more depth and more creatively, and you're stopping yourself, you're censoring yourself for thinking about that problem on your own terms for yourself, and that could be a big mistake. So the 4 principles of PACE, slowing pace, are play to your strengths, as I mentioned earlier, accept what you know and what you're good at and what you've researched and what you're interested in. That's good, but enhance those strengths. Don't just sort of let them play out at the superficial level. Be aware of what you don't know and be aware of how others would think. Be creative, and be creative in the sense of working through fine details and looking at the and the foundations of problems. And examine alternatives, sometimes arbitrarily examine alternatives. What would someone else from this other discipline think? So I've got another question for you. Tell me something interesting about an apple. Again, another past Oxford interview question. Tell me something interesting about an apple. Have a think about that and try and use these 4 principles of pace. Okay. Now, the impulsive sort of, if you like, knee-jerk reaction to a question like this would be to start with the biological and physical properties of apples. So, oh, well, their shape, their size, their colours, those sorts of things. Nothing wrong with that, but it is quite a sort of predictable and superficial analysis of an apple. What would a toddler say if given an apple for the first time? What might Sherlock Holmes say? Now, they would also sort of notice some of these basic observable facts about an apple, but they would also be interested in how the apple connects with other parts of our lives. You know, a toddler might ask, well, why do people give apples to teachers? Why is that a thing? I mean, it doesn't happen much anymore, but, you know, why was that ever considered a thing? And then, you know, this is perhaps beyond a toddler, but, you know, a Sherlock Holmes character would start to notice that the apple is an important symbol in all sorts of elements of our lives, not just as a nourishing fruit, but also as a really sort of powerful, totemic even, symbol of certain core aspects of our humanity. So, for example, the apple is supposedly the fruit of the tree of knowledge in the Bible, in Genesis, that leads to the fall of man. Now, actually, the Bible doesn't mention that the fruit of the tree of knowledge is an apple at all. So it's interesting to ask, well, why would we have taken that inferential step to assume that it was an apple? A likely answer to that is because of the European dominance of Christianity at certain formative moments, because apples are much more common in Europe than they are in the Middle East, where the Bible largely plays out. You know, more plausible if we were to actually take Genesis as playing out in Palestine, where it likely was written, then the fruit of the tree of knowledge would be more likely something like a fig. So it's even interesting that, you know, that the apple is this sort of crucial symbol of religion, which is fascinating, and it's especially fascinating because the apple is also one of the most totemic symbols of science. Almost paradoxically, it was the apple that assaulted Isaac Newton and encouraged him to develop his theories of gravity. So we've got this sort of amazing coincidence that the apple is at one and the same time a potent symbol of science and religion simultaneously. Now, apples are also important in other aspects of our lives. They're crucial to cookery. You know, home-cooked apple pie is this fantastic symbol of America. And sort of American values, which is fascinating. The Big Apple is a nickname for New York. Apple Computing is the world's largest company at the time of recording. Now, the story behind why Apple Computing have an apple symbol is itself really fascinating. The theory, although I don't know if this has been confirmed or not, is that Steve Jobs chose an apple out of it because Alan Turing, the man who designed and built the first ever electronic computer during the Second World War, ultimately killed himself by extracting cyanide from apple seeds, apple pips, and committed suicide using apples. And so the apple symbol for the computing company is a tribute to the father of modern computing, who died so tragically. So, you know, the apple is an insanely interesting symbol. It's not just that it is this fruit, which in itself has all sorts of interesting properties, but it's the connections that that fruit has in our social, cultural, political, historical lives. And this is what I mean. If you pace yourself, if you think slowly, you think, where have I seen apples, and where would other people see apples? You know, if an American was asked about apples, what sort of connotations would they bring? If someone from another part of the world was to talk about apples, what sort of associations might they make? Why are apples so ubiquitous, so important? What's interesting about apples? Okay, so that's what I mean by slowing things down, thinking carefully, and being empathetic in your thoughts. Think how someone else might approach this problem. Okay. So let's sort of use that acronym again, the PACE acronym. Play to your strengths, be aware of your weaknesses, be creative, and examine alternatives. And have a think about this question. This is a past interview question from medicine. Why do we have red blood cells? Why do we have red blood cells? So have a think about that for a second. Okay. Now, again, the knee-jerk reaction to a question like this is to draw on facts that you've been told about red blood cells, perhaps about their function in respiration of carrying gases and nutrients around the body, perhaps towards their unusual shape as a biconcave disc, looks a little bit like a sort of a rubber ring. So that's fine. That if you were to say those things in an Oxford interview, that would be fine. But the interviewers would want to enhance your thinking skills. So they would encourage, by asking questions, they would take you down this pace scale themselves. So they would ask you, well, tell me what you've learned about red blood cells. So they would develop your skills. They would play to your strengths. They would ask you to think about stuff that you might not know already about red blood cells. So they might give you some new information and see how you react to that. So, for example, they might tell you that certain crustacea, like crabs, have blue blood. And they might sort of give you that as a piece of information that you didn't necessarily have. And they'd encourage you to see if you can reflect on why they might have a different colour blood, and whether colour is itself significant. Now, there are various sort of responses to this. You wouldn't necessarily need to know it, but with the interviewer, you'd be encouraged to think about the significance of the colour. The blueness of blood in crabs is because their blood is copper-based rather than iron-based, or at least the hemoglobin that we have is iron-based, and it's hemocyanin. I can't remember the precise term that crabs have instead of hemoglobin, which is based from copper. Now, the sort of advantage of that pertains to the relative cold that crabs tend to live in is one possible advantage. Anyway, I mean, the point being that you need to be aware of stuff that you might not know about red blood cells, such as why they're red. It's the sort of thing that, again, a toddler might pick up on. Why is blood red? And that would be a really important perceptive question. Be creative. Think through the details. Why would we have cells? What's the point of having a cell for anything? A cell is a container at root. It's something that contains important chemicals. And why would you package things up? What's the point? It's not really the blood cell itself that's doing the respiration. It's the hemoglobin inside it. So why do we bother? Why not, like some insects, just have hemoglobin, or just have the gases just sort of dispersed through the air, through our sort of outer layers of skin? Now, the answer to that would be to do with our size and scale. That insects would have to be in a much richer oxygen environment for them to be much bigger than they currently are, because the oxygen simply can't permeate enough at the levels of their outer shells to get to their organs. And so when an organism grows in scale, then it needs some other mechanism other than just diffusion through its skin to get the gases that it needs. And so a cell is a good way of sort of enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness of respiration. So there's one hypothesis already. Why do we have red blood cells? Because we need to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of respiration. Another thing to think about is, why do you package anything? Think about in your own house, your own life, why would you ever put something inside something else? In a bag or in a box or in a suitcase or whatever. It can be to sort of bundle together things that ought to be kept somehow close to each other, or it can be to protect those items. So that's potentially another hypothesis, that we have red blood cells as a protective mechanism. Okay, so we've got a number of hypotheses as to why you would have red blood cells, that it can somehow improve the efficiency and somehow improve the protection of the package inside red blood cells, which is hemoglobin. So now we need to sort of examine some alternative thoughts. So how would you test those hypotheses? Would be a common way to develop an interview in medicine. How can your scientific mind work through this problem? And that's quite a difficult question, because the temptation in science is to try and work out how we could perform randomized controlled trials as being the gold standard of most of the scientific method. In other words, how can we take a control group and a subject group, have them be practically identical, save for one intervention that you are interested in? Now that's quite difficult if you want to try and test why we have red blood cells. You can't, for example, it wouldn't be particularly ethical if you took a human being, drained them of all their blood, and poured in nothing except hemoglobin, just see how long they last, because they'll just die, of course. I mean, that would be utterly unethical. And even trying to do such a thing on test animals would be considered utterly inappropriate. So sort of coming up with some laboratory conditioned testing for why we have red blood cells could be quite difficult. Now, it could be, therefore, that we'd be better off, rather than doing sort of experimental interventions, is to do comparisons. In other words, that one of the requirements of an experiment is that the researcher has a degree of control, of dominance over the tests and the control subjects. And it may be that that's just simply impossible or desperately unethical when it comes to red blood cells. So you might be better off adopting a comparative research design rather than an experimental design. Now, comparative design is where you don't have control. You, as the researcher, just look passively at different groups, and you hope that those groups are practically identical, save for the important difference that you're interested in. But you can't actually guarantee that. So, for example, when it comes to why we have red blood cells, you might find that there are twins, one of whom has a blood disorder and one of whom does not. So let's say, for example, that there's one twin who has sickle cell, which is a blood disorder which affects the shape of blood cells and massively impairs their effectiveness. It's a protective mechanism against malaria, in that the malaria will infect blood cells, and as a defense, the blood cells collapse into a sort of a sickle shape. So you could take the two twins, and you have one who's got sickle cell and one who does not, and see what happens. And often the symptoms of sickle cell are described as anemic symptoms. So sometimes it's even called sickle cell anemia. So the individuals who have sickle cell may have staved off the threat of malaria, but they are facing other life-threatening problems, such as problems with respiration, problems with getting their organs to function. At very severe levels, it can lead to death. So you get a sense from looking at those patients why it's important to have red blood cells. There are other blood disorders that could lead to that sort of comparative analysis. There are things like blood cancers like leukemia and blood disorders such as AIDS that would give you some insight into what the blood cells do when they're operating normally, if you like, and that can give you some insights. Now, as you've seen, we've taken a question that looks like it's a relatively sort of easy question, in the sense that most school children of the age of about 13, 14, 15 could probably take a stab at the answer, because they may have been taught it in a science lesson. But when we go into the depth that you'd expect from an Oxford interview, you start to see that it's got all sorts of interesting parameters that we can start to explore. Now, you wouldn't need to know all of those parameters before an Oxford interview, but if you slow down your thinking, if you think through PACE, in terms of the acronym that I've outlined here, you can start to anticipate the ways that an interview might develop the thought process. And even something that you think is a relatively straightforward question can develop in all sorts of interesting ways. Okay, so moving on, we've got this question from mathematics. When does 2 plus 2 not equal 4? When does 2 plus 2 not equal 4? Now, I've described this as thinking the unthinkable, which of course is impossible. You can't think the unthinkable, because by definition, if it's unthinkable, it can't be thought about. But the point I'm making here is that it can be tempting, when we adopt the sort of knee-jerk reaction to a problem, to just dismiss anything that doesn't compute. So for a lot of the questions so far, you will have been able to come up with some answers, perhaps because you've been taught certain aspects of that subject, or you've had conversations with people about them. But here's a question where most people don't have an instinctive response. It's the sort of thing that just doesn't compute. If you say to someone, when does 2 plus 2 not equal 4? They'll just sort of say, well, never. I just can't deal with that. That's just too weird of a question to even begin trying to resolve it. But if you use PACE, if you use thinking to your strengths, analysing your weaknesses, thinking creatively, and examining alternatives, you can start to unravel this question. And again, don't forget that when you're in an interview situation, the tutors are not going to expect you to just get on with it yourself. The idea of an Oxford interview is that it is collaborative. You and the admissions tutors are going to be working through these problems together. And the reason we do that is because we want to assess how well you could work in our teaching environment at Oxford, which is collaborative. So we're not just going to sort of sit back and say, well, come on, solve this problem. We're going to help you through it. Okay, so let's try and sort of unpack this. Well, for a start, when we say 2 + 2 = 4, what do we mean by 2? So this is, again, thinking like a toddler. What is 2? Now, okay, you might sort of think, well, what a stupid question. 2 is just two things, 2 of something. It's a quantifier. But how do you quantify things as 2? What if you were to have, let's say, 2 apples and 2 other apples, and you put them together and you say, right, now I've got 4 apples, so 2 + 2 = 4. But how did you determine that you actually had 2 apples in the first place? What made them a 2? What if one of the apples was actually 1.5 times larger than the other apple? Do you really have 2 apples of equal size? Well, no. So maybe you've had 2 apples and you've added 2 other apples, but you've actually made something like 4.5 or 5 apples in terms of actual volume or a quantity of apple. So start off with thinking about the notion of quantification. How do we distill something into 2 ever? So that might be one way to start. Another thing to think about is, again, sort of shifting your mind, your empathy to another domain. So mathematicians, when they're asked 2 + 2, what does that equal? They would say 4. But what would say a computer scientist think? Well, a computer scientist, when they're writing code, they might sort of ask, well, are we talking about strings or integers? So if it's an integer, then 2 + 2 = 4, sure. But if it's a string, then 2 + 2 = 22, because we're adding together 2 pieces of information and we're just creating a new hybrid. We're not adding them together in the sense of utterly combining them into a new cumulative whole. We're just sort of tacking them onto each other. So 2 + 2 = 22 would be a plausible and interesting answer. Another possible scenario is to think further about the notion of quantification and two-ness, if you like. Now, we typically in mathematics use the decimal system. Decimal derivative from the Latin for 10, same as decade or any other sort of use of decile. Anything that's divisible by 10. And so what you would say is that this is 2 to base 10 plus 2 to base 10, which does equal 4. So using the decimal system, 2 + 2 would equal 4. Now, what if we were to say that actually we're not using the decimal system, we're using the binary system? Now, this is not to base 10, but to base 2, hence binary. So there's only two quantities that a number can be, 1 or 0. Now, 2 in binary is 10. Okay, and you can look that up if you want some more information about binary, and binary is essential to modern computing. But so, for example, we could say 2 to base 10 plus 2 to base 2 equals 12. Okay, so it doesn't equal 4 because it equals 12. Now, what we've done there is break a few rules of mathematics. We tend to assume that when we've got numbers that they are to the same base level. Otherwise, when you perform transformations on them, you're going to get into a bit of a mess pretty quickly if you've not sort of clarified what base number they are to. But that raises another interesting phenomenon about maths, which is it is rule-bound. And anything that's rule-bound could potentially suffer breaches in those rules. You can break those rules. And it can be fun to think about how you could do that. So again, just sort of slow down. If someone says to you, when is 2 + 2 not equal 4? The temptation is just to sort of rabbit in the headlights, say, does not compute, can't even think of when that would ever be the case. If you just slow it down, just think carefully, what does it mean for 2 + 2 to equal anything? What does it mean for something to be equal to something else? You could start to extract some interesting thoughts from that. And while you're in lockdown due to coronavirus, you could start sort of exploring questions like this, and being curious and acting like a toddler can take you a very long way in that regard. Okay. Another quite common form of interview is to critically assess what somebody else has said. So here's a quote from a famous poet, W.H. Auden. The camera may do justice to laughter, but must degrade sorrow. Okay. Now, again, the instinctive reaction to something like this is a degree of panic that students sort of think, oh, I don't know who W.H. Auden is, or, oh, I don't know that quote. Now, that's fine, okay? We would not be testing your thinking skills very well if we just asked you, what stuff do you know? Because just knowing stuff isn't a particularly useful or impressive skill. So, and also, apart from anything else, we take applicants from hundreds of different countries. So I think at last count we had representatives from about 140 countries around the world. So it may be that a lot of British students would have heard of W.H. Auden, and maybe they hadn't, and that would be fine as well. But people from around the world would be very unlikely to know about W.H. Auden, and it would be unreasonable of us to have assumed that foreknowledge. So we don't. We just don't. So if you've not heard of Auden, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Just think about what he said. Now, the next sort of temptation is, after panicking and thinking I don't know who Auden is to start thinking, well, he must be right. This is some sort of famous man, and surely he's right, and I must be wrong, and everything I say must be somehow wrong, and so I must just agree with him. Now, that again, I'm afraid, is a mistake. We are in Oxford interviews are trying to test your capacity to think independently. So don't just sort of automatically, instinctively say, oh, Auden's obviously correct. Think critically and creatively. You can agree with Auden, by all means, but don't just feel the need to agree with him. Certainly don't feel the need to do so without any exploration of the possibility that he's wrong. Okay? So that's the first sort of thing. Always be aware of what your instincts are telling you. Don't necessarily abandon them, but make sure that you've given yourself the time to think it through. And in an Oxford interview, it's absolutely fine to take a bit of a breather. Take a few seconds to think through your answer before you respond. You don't have to blurt things out immediately. So let's unpack the question. Let's sort of do the toddler / Sherlock Holmes routine on this question. The camera may do justice to laughter. Now, the choice of modal verb there is interesting. The camera may do justice, not it will do justice, not it might do justice, but it may do. So that's an interesting thing to pick up on. Again, attention to detail is important. It may do justice to laughter. Now, what does that mean? So that implies that a camera taking photographs, excuse me, can somehow capture what it means to laugh. So it can do justice to laughter. But it must degrade sorrow. So again, the modal verb must is interesting here. It must degrade. There's no equivocation here. It's not it may degrade sorrow, it must. It will inevitably degrade sorrow. So start with some comprehension. What is Auden saying? He's saying that you can take a photo of someone laughing, and by looking at that photo you can get a sense of it. It captures the notion of laughter pretty well, but it will never fully encapsulate what it means to be sorrowful. So if you've got a photo of somebody crying, rending themselves through pain or what have you, that image will never fully communicate those emotions. Now that's an interesting statement, and I suppose it's tempting to sort of think that it is broadly speaking correct, that there seems to be a sort of an upper limit to the emotions of happiness, but no upper limit to the emotions of sadness. In other words, we've all sort of laughed to the greatest possible extent. We've been sort of in fits of giggles because of something utterly hilarious. But it's difficult to imagine that there would be something much beyond that would be even funnier. Whereas when it comes to sorrow, sorrow seems to go in a much broader scale. Practically everyone will have experienced some degree of sorrow in their lives, but it's always possible to imagine someone in an even more sorrowful position. And so it's quite difficult to imagine a sort of a top end of that emotional scale. And so the camera might be able to capture laughter because we can easily empathize with someone laughing, even if it's in a still image. But if it's an image of someone who's in distress, it can be really difficult to fully empathize with them. So that could be how we could comprehend what Auden is saying here. But then let's try and sort of think critically, well, is he right? Well, maybe the camera isn't necessarily the problem here. Maybe it's practically impossible to ever fully empathize with someone's sorrow. That even if you are physically present with someone who is in utter distress, can you really understand? Can you do justice to their sorrow? Can you feel their pain? It's a tempting shorthand to say, I feel your pain. But do you? Do you really? Is that even possible? Is that degree of empathy possible? Maybe not. Maybe. I mean, as I say, I don't have the answer to this. I'm just sort of thinking this through. So perhaps Auden is sort of unfairly focusing on the camera as a sort of technical barrier between us and the subject. But it could be that that barrier would be there even if the only thing between us and them were our eyes, not a camera lens. The other thing to think about is, what cameras is he talking about? Well, he's talking about cameras. You may not know this, but this is the sort of information that an interviewer might share, that Auden was alive in the early to mid 20th century. So his notion of what a camera is capable of will be fixed in that particular technological epoch. Now, modern cameras are capable of far more impressive abilities to capture images, not only still but moving images, and a whole host of other sort of technical things, including not just color but also all sorts of sounds and heat and all sorts of interesting things. So camera technology is vastly improved from the time that Auden was writing. So maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it is that the camera can better capture sorrow now because it can give more detail, it can give more depth of vision, and not only vision but also audio. So these are things that you can think about, but just always check your instinctive willingness to just follow authority, to just sort of say, well, Auden must be right, very famous poet, I mustn't sort of say he's wrong. No, why not? It's I don't think you should be a critic, a sort of an instinctive critic, and someone who just says, well, everyone's wrong except for me, because that can be just as intellectually superficial as constantly agreeing with people. But at the same time, take time to think for yourself and be critical and be independent-minded, just as a toddler might, just as Sherlock Holmes would. Okay. So, finally, this is the sort of question where the problem is ultimately unsolvable. So how can you even go about doing this? So the question is, how many windows are there in London? Now, the instinctive response to an unsolvable question is to sort of ask, well, why bother? What's the point? Why are you wasting my time with this silly question that can't be answered? And that sort of degree of hostility to the question is a really bad idea in an Oxford interview, because the point is that, yes, you will never come up with a resolute answer to this question, but the skill developed in trying can be extremely useful, because if you are able to estimate the number of windows in London, then you could estimate all sorts of other parameters that are unknown. For example, you might be able to estimate how many people will vote for a certain political party at the upcoming election. It operates on the similar principle of taking a sample and extrapolating from that sample to an unknown parameter, in this case the population. Or you may be able to work out how many interventions are needed in a medical trial in order to obtain herd immunity. So this is now an ongoing problem with regards to the coronavirus problem. So don't sort of look at the problem and think, well, what a useless waste of everyone's time. This is a silly question that will never be answered. Think more about what the question is trying to develop in terms of your skills, in terms of your thinking skills, and that will be the best way to sort of approach it. And again, just take it slow, just have a think about things, and think through the question very deliberately, very carefully. How many windows are there in London? Well, let's take charge of this question. What are windows? Let's define windows. Let's sort of think, well, fairly uncontroversially, windows would be those holes in buildings that are often glazed with glass that we can look through. So fine, that's fairly uncontroversial. But what about car windows? Should we include those? And what about mirrors? Is mirror a window? Window on the soul, perhaps? That's maybe a bit extravagant, but what about sort of car wing mirrors? It's not really a window because you can't really see through it, but okay. What about the Windows operating system on people's phones and computers? Would that count? Windows is lowercase here, so it's not a proper noun. It's therefore implying windows in buildings, but it could be that if you want to be creative, you could talk about windows in a more expansive sense. So start by just thinking through what the question even means or how it can be interpreted. And then, for goodness sake, what is London, right? So London is often defined by the boroughs that form Greater London, Inner and Greater London. But you might sort of think, well, that's not true London, that true London is just the city of London, the square mile, or that true London is, at the minimum, the cities of Westminster and London, the two cities. And you're going to ignore the boroughs because that's just not real London. Well, so again, there's stuff that you need to pin down. There's ambiguity in the question that you need to work out. Okay, so then the next thing that you need to work out is how you can go about estimating it. You can never know for sure how many windows there are in London, so you need to start with something that you could count for sure and extrapolate upwards. So it may be that you take a small sample, so you could take a particular geographic sample, and you would have some sort of good reason for suggesting that that geographic sample was representative of London. And you could count all of the windows there and then extrapolate out to the rest of London, and that would give you a good sort of estimate. Now, it may be that one particular geographic sample would be a problem because it's not necessarily representative, so you might want to take 2, 3, 4, 50, 100 geographic samples. And you could average the number of windows from each of those samples and then multiply it out to the whole of London. So, there are various ways that you can estimate the unknown parameter, but I suppose my key advice here is just go with it. Even though the problem is technically unsolvable, you can come up to a solution which is workable nonetheless, that gives us some steer, some handle on the problem. And often, I'm afraid, that's the best you can ever hope for, and you just need to sort of accept that some things will never be absolutely known. Okay, so what should you do now? So now that you may have time at home because of the lockdown, what can you do? Well, again, just go through these 4 parameters. Play to your strengths. So if you're interested in something, if you've done some research in the past, go further down that rabbit hole. Go much further. Go into really fine detail. Read what other people have written about. Read their thoughts, but read them critically. Don't ever let someone dominate your thinking process. Don't let them become the new people that add to your instinctive, knee-jerk response to questions. Whenever you're reading something, don't read it passively, read it critically. Is this person right? How have they reached this conclusion? Do I agree with them? Why do I agree with them? Ask yourself those sorts of questions. Acknowledge your weaknesses. Work out what you don't know. Now, bear in mind that the further down the academic path you go, the more you realise how little you know. And it's certainly true of me. The more I study things, the less I feel I really understand them, because I just realise how many holes there are in my knowledge. And that's okay, right? That's normal. So don't worry if when you're assessing your weaknesses that you realise there may be a lot of them, because that's just normal. So don't be alarmed by that, but just be aware of it. And perhaps be acutely aware of conspicuous weaknesses in what you might know that you think you ought to know, or that you think would be useful to know. And bear in mind that also, in fact, just knowing stuff isn't necessarily the key problem here. It's thinking skills. We're more interested in universities like Oxford and how you think than stuff that you know. Okay. So then you need to be creative. So think through things in fine detail. Think more like a toddler. Be perceptive and persuasive. Don't take anything for granted. Look around you, in your house, in your home, just out the window. Look at things that you've perhaps taken for granted because they've been there your whole life, and look at them again. What about a tree? What's interesting about a tree? I mean, loads of things are interesting about trees, and we're tempted to take them for granted. If you think about them very carefully and diligently, you'll find out all sorts of wonderful things about these upside down waterfalls that somehow transport gallons of water from the ground up to the top leaves, and that sustain themselves alive through some of the harshest conditions, and have not only sort of incredible biological features, but also, similar to the apple, have wondrous symbolic and cultural value as well. So don't take anything for granted. Be perceptive, like a toddler, like Sherlock Holmes. And think through alternatives. Once you've settled on a conclusion, once you've worked out, well, I think humanity's greatest achievement is this, try and push yourself into thinking what other people would argue. And try and imagine, be empathetic with those thinkers. What would I conclude if I was not interested in sciences but more interested in the arts and humanities? Or what if I was more of a mathematician than I am a historian? How would that change my perception of this question? Be empathetic. That's not because you need to change your mind. It's just because you need to anticipate what other people would say and what other people would think. It strengthens your position. So it's not to weaken your position. Okay, so there's a few things to do here, but perhaps the ultimate piece of advice is have fun. I think developing thinking skills ought to be as enjoyable as possible. A lot of people assume that Oxford students and academics are terribly serious, that we just try and cram our brains with data and we don't have any fun. But actually, the most successful students and academics are those that think very carefully about what motivates them. They care deeply and desperately about learning because they find it empowering and enriching, because they still have that sort of dizzying curiosity of a petulant toddler. And I definitely include myself in that. I just can't stand not knowing stuff or not thinking about things and taking lots of phenomena for granted. I just can't deal with that. And I genuinely enjoy thinking through things. So for goodness sake, have fun. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. When you're trying to read about new subjects, if you're trying to watch lectures on YouTube, if you're trying to download podcasts, start with the stuff you care about. Start with problems that you think are really interesting. And you can frame them as questions like a toddler might. Why do we yawn? Why do we have nightmares? Does my phone get heavier when I download apps onto it? How much does the internet weigh? Could you ever have a number greater than infinity? Just start by just indulging your curiosity. Go and explore what other people have come up with. But then, for goodness sake, think about it for yourself. Go for your daily allotted exercise walk that we're allowed now under the COVID-19 situation, and just give yourself a chance to sort of try and think through the various parameters of that question. Think through it diligently and at pace, and you will massively enhance your thinking skills. And if you allot yourself about half an hour to 45 minutes a day, I know that sounds like quite a lot, but it should be fun and enjoyable, and there's usually something in everyone's day that they can cut down or cut out, then you will massively enhance your thinking skills. It will make you a really competitive applicant to a university like Oxford. But regardless of what you do, I very much hope that you stay safe and well at this difficult time. And if you'd like to contact me, please by all means do so at matthew.williams@jesus.ox.ac.uk. That's matthew.williams@jesus.ox.ac.uk, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much. All the best. Goodbye.